Well, good morning. You know, today we say goodbye to June and look forward to the month that is usually the most summery of our year. We'll see how that works out. You know, speaking of things working out, a young man came to work for TV6 40 years ago today, and he's still here and is one of the most recognized people in Upper Michigan. We'll talk with him right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, that young man who came here 40 years ago is Steve Asplund. In the ensuing years, Steve has done just about everything a newsman can do. But more recently, he's best known as the anchor of TV6 First Look and co-anchor of the TV6 Early News. He's seen a lot of changes in those 40 years, and this morning we'll talk about some of them. Steve, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Thank you very much, Don. It's a pleasure.
Nice to have you with us. You know, congratulations on reaching this milestone.
Thank you. It is quite a milestone. Never thought I'd get this far, but it's been a pleasure all the way through.
So you never thought when you first walked through the doors of this place that you would be here 40 years later?
Well, when you get out of school and you take your first job, it's always one of those situations that you look at, you're saying like, oh, I'll be here for 2, maybe 3 years, and then I want to move up to bigger stations, bigger markets, more excitement and so forth.
So just a little background, and we've done some of this before, but
yeah.
You grew up in Milwaukee.
Correct.
And I think you went to college there too, didn't
Yeah,
you?
I went to, I'm actually the suburb of Milwaukee called Brookfield. That's where I grew up, and I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, graduated from there, and during my schooling days, I drove a semi and paid for school and so forth as I went through college. And then out of college, it was like, well, I need to apply my degree in some fashion. And so I applied at various places. And back those days, you applied at radio stations.
Right.
You didn't go to television right away because that was sacred property.
Right.
But I said,
radio was like the farm system for TV back then.
it was, exactly. And so I sent it to various radio stations and got some interviews. And just on a whim, I sent it to the Wisconsin and Upper Michigan stations for television just to see what was out there. And lo and behold, WLUC called. John Williams, who was the news director back then, called and said, why don't you come up for an interview? And the rest is history, as they say.
And we've talked about this once before, but when you showed up for that interview, things weren't exactly as you had planned, were they?
It was very unusual. I mean, I had all these thoughts that it was going to play out just as I had thought in my mind, but when I got here, there was the receptionist, who was Linda Hale at that time, at the front desk. And she said, like, welcome, and who are you? And then I announced who I was, and I was here for a job interview. And they said, well, there's nobody in the newsroom right now. And I said, well, oh, okay. So I took a seat, and she said, everybody's out on the Frontenac, which was on fire off the Keweenaw Peninsula. So the whole newsroom cleared out to go and cover the story. So
that was your beginning at TV6.
That was the introduction, and eventually they told me, why don't you go to the Holiday Inn and get a room, and then we'll give you a call later.
And I take it the interview and audition went okay?
It did. I was a little nerve-wracking because they said we had to squeeze you in right before the newscast, and so they gave me a script which wasn't exactly in the right order, and I just read it, and later it was, we'll meet for dinner later. I'm going like, oh, this is not going to come out well. But
yeah, right.
In the end it did, and so it worked out well.
What was your first assignment here at TV6? What were you doing?
I was a reporter. Basically, back then, you were a reporter. You went out and filmed, because we had 16mm film back then. So we would film the story, come back and edit the story and put our voice to it, and then put it on the air that night. And then that day, it was only a 6 o'clock and an 11 o'clock newscast. There was nothing else, no internet or anything of such kind.
When you mentioned film, you know, that's really a story of the evolution of news gathering in itself. People have to appreciate, what was it like to work with film, for example?
It's very tricky because people don't realize with videotape, I mean, you can reuse shots or you can just shoot stuff and manipulate it as you do today. But back then you shot film and one shot was all you got. I mean, you used that one shot, and if you didn't shoot any extra video or any extra film, you didn't have much of a story. So you were kind of limited on that. Plus they also said like, oh, we have to stick to a strict film budget here because film and processing of that film was rather expensive in its day.
And processing was part of that whole
it was.
routine too.
You had to learn how to process, so you'd go to the basement and they'd run it through the machine, turn the chemicals on and off at certain variables, and hopefully everything turned out. Because when you shot film, you had to use a light meter, so every shot you had to get your light reading, then set your iris to that on the camera, and then you'd hopefully have a good shot and it would come out of the processor in that way too.
And editing the film was a very tedious procedure too.
It was. I mean, you would just take the film and rip it, you know, like that, and just
Right.
we had tape, so you would put it on a splicer and tape it, and then you'd run it into the reel and so forth. And all the stories had to go in a certain order because they would go on the film chain, and then they would just play out. And you had your audio on audio carts, and they had to be queued up exactly right. So if they were miscued, you'd have cut 2 with film 1, and so it was kind of one of those things you had to be exact on.
Okay. The news staff back at those days was not nearly as big as it is today.
No, back then I think there was 7 of us altogether, including the on-air and the people in the field and so forth. Now we're at 28, 26 full-time and 2 part-time. So it's grown considerably, and the area that we cover has grown as well.
I think the clothing changed a little bit too. People.
That's not the only thing. My hair used to be dark. Now it's pretty white.
Okay. There have been so many changes that you've been part of, and of course you're the news director as well. And what do you see as the major change in TV news gathering up here?
You know, that's a question a lot of people ask. It says, well, what's changed over the years that you've been here? And it's the technology, basically. I mean, we've gone from, like I mentioned, 16 millimeter film up to what we use now are SD cards. And there's no comparison between what you used to do and what you do today. Not to mention the addition of the internet, social media, all those aspects. And along with that technology advances comes the immediacy of the news. It's not that you waited for 6 and 11 o'clock anymore. It was like you're on the scene of a story and it had to be reported now. So it's instantaneous,
Right.
whereas you used to wait for that coveted 6 or 11 o'clock hour.
Right. We'll talk some more about that in just a couple of minutes. I'll be back with more on today's show just 2 minutes from now. Our guest this morning is Steve Asplund, TV6 News Director and anchor, and Steve just has received his 40-year certificate for being here all those years at TV6.
Well, thank you. Very kind.
Yeah, you know, we were talking about the equipment, and,
Oh, yeah.
and not only was it, well, you know, film was not just as efficient as video is today, but you were hauling around some pretty big stuff, weren't you?
Yeah, and the thing is, you know, every reporter had to do it. I mean, you had a tripod that was probably close to 20 pounds. You had the camera on your shoulder. Then you had a cord that connected to the recorder, and that hung on your other shoulder. Then you had the light belt, which was probably 20 pounds. That went around your waist. Then the light on the camera. And then you also, you know, when you're a one-man band, you're doing it all yourself, you had the microphone cord and the microphone in your hand, and then you had to hold that out for the person to interview, and all at the same time, you know, so it got kind of tricky.
We didn't have as many young women back then as
No, but there was
reporters.
one gal, and I won't mention her name, but she was about 100 pounds, and she carried that stuff through the snow and everywhere anybody else would.
You could
No
almost
problem.
see her loading up and just falling
Sinking.
into the ground.
Yeah.
Right. We've got some video this morning.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and this, you're going to get a chance to see a young Steve Asplund. And Steve, you can kind of, well,
Oh, my.
what is this about?
This is my one of my first stories for what we called First Monday, and that is parachuting school. So in one day, I went through a school, and then I parachuted out of an airplane. This is down at Delta County.
Oh, no, is that you?
That is me. Oh,
Wow.
nice landing.
Have you ever
Wow.
done that since then?
No, I have not. It was on a static line.
Look at this guy. This is a mustache. That's something different.
That when I first started here, I had a mustache and I wore like a turtleneck with a houndstooth coat. That's a public service announcement for blood donations. This is up in Copper Harbor in February, the one-room schoolhouse in Copper Harbor, which still exists today. And we did a story on the fact that it was K through 8, I believe, at that time, all the way through that area. Those students, about 80 back then, would go to this one room, and all would be in different grades throughout their tenure in the
This
school.
guy looks pretty young.
Yeah, really young and dark hair. This was 1980, and this is in Sault Ste. Marie. And believe it or not, there was a house of prostitution in the Sioux, and Ethel Brand ran the house, and she was being called into court for not paying her taxes. So she went and paid her taxes, so they couldn't shut her down. But eventually, it went away, and Ethel went on to other things. But quite an interesting story, and
Yeah,
a
I
lot
can
of
see
people
that.
that took
And
interest
this is
in it.
Ethel herself?
That's Ethel there herself.
Okay.
This is my anchoring days back in 1984. And that was one of the many sets we had here at TV6 in regards to that. That's Monty Black on the right, screen right. And I'm doing the weather here, believe it or not.
Okay.
I did all sorts of things. I did the weather, I did sports from time to time, mainly the news, but those days you had to draw your own maps. You remember those.
I do, yes.
Yeah, you had to draw your own map and with colored pencils. That's what most of your day was. This is 1987, and again, another set in regards to that, but I look at those pictures and I look so young.
You do, you do. Yeah, is that the same guy?
Yeah.
And who's this guy?
This is Craig Shellschmidt, or
Okay,
Craig Shell,
okay.
as he was known on
You
the
a
air.
weatherman?
He was the meteorologist,
Right.
and he eventually went to Portland, Oregon. That's Frank Culbertus. He did sports, and he also anchored our newscast for a time here, back in 1994. And that's Cynthia Thompson, who's the current news director at our competition, Channel 3.
Right.
And that is Carl Bonac with hair and a mustache.
In his earlier days?
And Mike Ludlam, he hasn't changed much.
No,
He
no.
looks pretty much the same. And there's Carl again doing the weather, and that was a whole different weather computer system we had back then as well, so very different.
The
And that's
younger Greg Trick?
Greg Trick, yep, Greg Trick back in 1994. So, and then Glenn Gresham, who ironically is from Cucaulin downstate, and he's an EMT with the local fire department down there. This is the snow statue building that's up at Michigan Tech.
And I think that pretty well covers our video.
It does.
Just so many questions come out of that.
Yeah.
But all the people you've worked with.
Oh my
over the
gosh.
years.
Yeah, there have been hundreds. You know, I haven't even kept track. I should have, and I should have taken each, had their picture and to
Right.
look back at. But there have been hundreds of people, and that's what's the most inspiring part of the job and working here and being the news director and so forth, is the people you come in contact with, the stories they have, and then when they leave here, where they go. And that's our real sense of accomplishment that we feel that when they do leave, and if they want to, they will. They can move on to bigger and better things.
Yeah, I know, and I can't remember if they were before you or not, but a couple of local people have done well. One was Carol Anderson.
Carol Anderson, I worked with her.
Okay.
She's down in Greenville, I believe.
Somewhere down in North or South Carolina.
Carolina, correct.
And I think, I don't know if she's still at it or not.
She
but-
is.
Okay.
She's at WYFF.
Okay, and Scott Garso was another.
Scott, he went, I think, to Arizona, and then he ended up in Baltimore as the voice of the Baltimore Orioles and Ravens. So he's done very well.
And George Graffis from Marquette went on to be in Green Bay for many years.
He did, and he just recently retired, I think, a year or two ago as the meteorologist at WBAY. So he's since retired and enjoying the easy life. He loves sailing, so that was a great opportunity for him.
The other question that comes out of that is all the stories you've covered.
Oh, wow.
You know, it's just amazing.
It is, and some of the memorable ones have to be with the Air Force. When the Air Force Base K.I. Sawyer was here, flying on the B-52 and the tanker KC-135. I even got to fly with the Thunderbirds.
Wow,
And
wow.
that was just remarkable, flying in the F-16 jet and so forth. And then you and I took the trip on the Indiana Harbor.
Right, yes.
And went from Marquette down to Essexville
Yep.
with a load of iron
Coal.
ore and
Yep.
coal.
Yep.
So that was that was a great time, and it really had a marvelous opportunity. There's things in this job that you get to do that normally you would never have the opportunity to do, or the people that you can talk to.
You could write a book, as they say.
You could.
Right now, we have to take a break. I'll be back with more in just 2 minutes from now. That old expression, someone who needs no introduction, certainly applies today, as our guest is Steve Asplund, who has spent more time on the air here than any person in the history of this company.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure all along.
You've taken on additional responsibilities. You know, you are the news director, and everything is changing so much. We talked about how things changed during your era, and
Right.
obviously you're responsible for leading some of that change now. I know you were recently at a news directors meeting for our corporation. What are the things they're focusing on today?
Well, a lot of what the new technology is bringing to the forefront is with the internet, the websites, Facebook, and so forth, how to get the message out, and actually delivering the news more online than it is as far as on the air. And that's because there's a downward trend for people watching television, but online it's increasing. So people are getting more of their news product from the websites and so forth that are out there. So you see that trend kind of building up, and so a lot of the discussion had to do with how to make more, I guess, more presentable news products on the internet or on the social media sites, and basically how to draw people to those sites, what kind of promotional value, and most importantly, how do you make money on the internet.
Right.
Because that's the $64,000 question.
You know, and there was a time when, well, you wouldn't put it on the internet until after it went on the air because
Right.
you wanted to protect your newscasts. But now the idea is just get the news and get it on somewhere.
It is, exactly. I mean, you don't wait for that, in our case, you don't wait for 5, 6, 7, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock to put the product on the air. You go right to the internet, so you'll end up doing reports right from the scene. Facebook Lives, for example. We had one the other day with the fire down at the Pembine Depot. So those type of breaking news events, they want them on right away. Put them out there so people know, because they're consuming the news 24 hours a day. You never know when somebody's going to look in or want that information in regards. And that's the beauty of the website too, because they can look at their leisure, their own appointment they can make for that kind of interaction with the news.
And social media has kind of made for some cultural changes too. Is our audience changing, do you think?
I think it has. I mean, this is just strictly my opinion, but I think people have that less and less face-to-face communication, and that kind of, I guess, gives people a different feeling about how they consume the news and how they interact with it. With that less face-to-face and that less kind of personality or personal touch that you have there, it kind of gives it a different flavor and so forth. People are more opinionated and they look for those areas or those type of venues that kind of cater to their feelings, their likes and dislikes.
You know, I always feel that TV6 and the UP learned about TV together because TV6 was the first one here. And over the years, we've kind of grown together. But you think about all the joys and the sadness that TV6 has reported on. It's just, it's awesome to think about.
There have been huge milestones throughout the tenure of this station, which is 63 years old this year. And it continues on into the future. I mean, there's everything from mines opening and closing to the K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base closing to various individuals that have passed away, Representative John Keevala and so forth. But TV has always been there bringing the information and that kind of eye on what's happening to the viewer at home.
And the joy when someone wins a state championship in a high school sport.
That's right, Escanaba girls softball, for example, just recently, yeah.
And of course, we've covered some pretty big floods as well.
We did. We just this month in June, we did the Houghton anniversary, which is 1 year ago. They had that devastating flood that wiped out Houghton and Hancock and really caused a lot of turmoil. And
you and I worked together on some Easter Seal telethons.
We did.
And they were a lot of fun. And I think you were here in time for the March of Dimes telethon.
You know, that was my favorite telethon of all, the March of Dimes, because it was all locally produced right here at TV6, all in this studio in regards to 24 hours, I think it was 22 hours that we actually did. And it was just the cameras in the middle of the studio, and there were like 4 sets all around, and it just went on and on and on. Everything from, dance classes to rock and roll bands to Bill Leapart and his poetic justice that he would do.
It was just like chaos in the whole building.
It was.
And especially when a rock band was playing.
Oh, yeah.
And you were trying to get lined up for another interview, and it was just crazy.
Yeah, it was, but it was so much fun, though. And that's the exciting thing about doing television and doing this, is that you have a lot of fun. And that's been my mantra throughout, is that as long as I'm having fun, then I'll be around.
And you've been part of the annual gathering of food as well.
That's very true.
So there's just been so many things that have gone on through the years that have been so much to think about.
There are, and there's so many things that you look back, and that's why it's a great opportunity to kind of look back through the memory banks in regards to what we've been through, what we've seen, and so forth, and what is yet to come. It's always exciting every day.
Okay, thanks for coming in and sharing those memories this morning.
Well, thank you.
Okay, I'll have some other thoughts for you in just a couple of minutes. Well, this morning our discussion focused on a lot of changes in television in the last 40 years, so I thought, why not take it back even further? Back to the time when TV6 first went on the air and I was graduating from high school. We recently saw another graduation season come and go, so this should be a real cautionary tale for high school graduates. I say that because I never would have imagined the change that would occur in my lifetime. And looking 60 years out for today's graduates, the change will most likely be even greater. TV6 went on the air when I was a senior in high school, and that really marked the advent of television in the Upper Peninsula. But what else was going on about that time as I received my diploma from Ishpeming High School. Well, beside the fact that television had just arrived, there were no computers in the home, no video games, no cell phones, no social media. In those days, we actually did things, including talking to people face to face. What was happening on national television in 1957? Well, actually, the final new episode of I Love Lucy was broadcast. We just think it was on longer because we've been watching the 181 episodes of the show ever since. American Bandstand made its debut that year, and some of the other favorites were Leave It to Beaver, Ed Sullivan, Alfred Hitchcock, and Father Knows Best. What else was happening back in those days? Well, the Wham-O Company produced the first Frisbee. Dr. Seuss' The Cat in the Hat was published, and one of the popular movies was The Bridge on the River Kwai. And speaking of bridges, the Mackinac Bridge, the world's longest suspension bridge, opened to connect Michigan's two peninsulas. You no longer had to wait for a ferry to get across. On the not-so-pleasant side, the world was devastated by the Asian flu pandemic, with over 150,000 deaths, including 70,000 in the United States. And Russia took the early lead in the space race by launching the Sputnik rocket. Here are a few statistics that sound pretty amazing today. Average cost of a new house, $12,200. Monthly rent averaged about $90. That makes more sense when you realize the average yearly wage was about $4,500. You could buy eggs for 28 cents a dozen and some bacon to go with your eggs for 60 cents a pound. And this one really hurts. A gallon of gas was 24 cents. So the real question becomes, what will life be like when today's graduates retire? What will life be like in 2080? When I look back at all the things that have happened in the last 60 years, I can't imagine what we can expect in the 60 that lie ahead. All we know for sure is that I won't be around to see it. I'll be back in a minute. Time for us to wrap it up for another week. The Today Show will be here in a moment. Keep UpperMichiganSource.com in mind for the latest news anytime and a rebroadcast of current and past episodes of this show. Thanks to Steve Asplund for coming in this morning to share some memories from his 40-year career with TV6. And thank you for joining us. I'll be here next week. Hope you can join me.